Mike Donkin with that report. Well, Maria Bentley Dingwall, Derek Bentley's niece, is with me. What kept you going all these years?
Knowing that Derek never shot anybody, that he was innocent. And if you know someone's innocent, you just want to carry on.
How would your mother, Iris, have felt today, do you think?
Very joyful, but sad at the same time because her brother's not here. And the same as I am sad because my mother's not here to see today happen. 45 years we've been fighting this, knowing all the time that we were right.
Did you always feel you'd win? You'd always see this day?
Yes. And, you know, even if there was the slightest chance that we wasn't going to win today, we would still carried on the fight.
And we took note of your comments in the film about Kenneth Clarke. Do you find yourself blaming a whole line of Home Secretaries, essentially all Home Secretaries, or just Kenneth Clarke himself, or the system, or what?
Well, we didn't ask every Home Secretary. It's just when we actually had evidence that we could actually put to them, and Kenneth Clarke was one of the ones. And he's, let's face it, you know, he's a barrister. He should be able to see through it.
Lord Carr, you were Derek Bentley's MP for a time. You're also Home Secretary yourself. Were you aware of all the dubious nature of the conviction in this case when you were Home Secretary?
No, I was not. As far as I can recall, and it's come to me suddenly today, and it's over 20 years ago since I was Home Secretary, but as far as I can recall, the Bentley case never came to my desk during my term of office. I remember it, of course, very well as a local MP, and I remember the whole aura of the case was one of the main factors which turned me against capital punishment and made me the firm abolitionist I've been for a long time. But given that I do not remember while I was Home Secretary having to look at the papers at all. There were other murder cases where I did, and my problem at those days was that I could only reopen the case if genuine new evidence was brought forward.
Otherwise
I had no power as Home Secretary to interfere with the court.
I'm sorry to interrupt, look, I was just going to say that's a crucial point, isn't it? That even if you had anecdotally from the family locally heard things that made you worried about the case, you didn't actually have the power to reopen it as Home Secretary.
Now, as far as I can recall, and it's difficult after all this time, I do not remember during my 2 years as Home Secretary being asked to do anything about the case. I saw members of the family many times over the years, but at no time do I remember that.
Do you feel critical of those of your successors who did have the power to do something and didn't?
Now, I very much question. Now, I do not feel critical of my successors. I don't know all the facts at this short notice, of course. But the problem was this constitutional point that the Home Secretary had no power to order the reopening of a case unless fresh new evidence was put before him. And otherwise, you could do nothing. What I think we have learned is that the system in that respect was flawed, and I'm glad to say it has now been changed by the establishment of this review committee.
You accept, Maria, do you, that some Home Secretaries simply couldn't do anything at all?
Oh yes, I know Lord Carr didn't have any, you know, we didn't put a case before him, but we certainly did with Kenneth Clarke. We certainly had new evidence for him, and he just didn't accept it.
You see, Norman Brennan, you're Director of the Victims of Crime Trust. Are you alarmed today at the way the fingers have been pointed at the police?
Absolutely. Let's put one thing clear here. Nobody has mentioned Sid Miles, apart from he was the police officer that was killed. And let's also point out one further thing. There was two young offenders, one aged 16 and one aged 19, that were on the roof of a warehouse. One was armed with a handgun. That handgun was loaded with bullets. They were going out on a criminal mission. A police officer, a brave police officer, climbed on the roof and confronted them. And as a result of that, he lost his life. Now, as far as I'm concerned, the police in this country are absolutely slated, never more so than the last 6 weeks. I have been out this week with families of police officers that have been murdered, and the devastation it causes them, and the police service as a whole, where one of our colleagues is actually murdered, is normally always forgotten. As soon as there's some bad news about the police, all the millions of good things, including many police officers that have laid their lives down for society, is forgotten.
But if Derek Bentley was innocent, there was always going to be a day, wasn't there, like this, of celebration for his family?
Absolutely, but there's no celebration for Sid Miles' family, and I don't really want to get to the ins and outs of this. You've won your day. We lost a colleague,
And we, as a family, we lost a friend because we knew Sid Miles, which is not necessarily well known. But all the policemen within certainly the House of Commons today were coming up to me and shaking my hand. I've got every admiration for our police force. They have a difficult job under the circumstance. You know, I've sat on the police boards myself, so I know exactly where they're coming from.
You do obviously see my point. That,
I see your point exactly, but you know, you've also
a member of your family was on that roof,
and he was, which we're not
with someone that wasn't just armed with a piece of wood or wasn't just breaking into a house. They had a handgun loaded with bullets.
Christopher Craig had a handgun, and Derek was under arrest for 15 minutes, and was very passive in that 15 minutes, which has been brought out in the papers today.
As I said, I'm not here really to argue the points, but the police never ever are allowed to stand up for themselves, and I, on behalf of my dead colleague, am.
Let me just widen this to the way in which these decisions are made now, because of course it's gone out the hands of the various Home Secretaries, and it's gone to something called the Criminal Cases Review Commission. Now, Benedict Bernberg, family sister for the Bentleys, you happy that that will actually solve things?
Well, it'll certainly mean that we're not so likely to have the experience that we had at the hands of the Home Office year after year. Here is a new, entirely independent body who's charged with referring miscarriages of justice, and they've started off extremely well. They've been operating for a year now. They have referred quite a number of cases already to the court, many more than the Home Office did in its period of time. And they've started well, and I think if they continue in that way, we're not going to get the same sort of experiences.
Let's put that to Leonard Lee, who's a commissioner on the Criminal Cases Review Commission. Are you content, Mr. Lee, in the view that actually you will do it better than Home Secretaries did?
Well, I think we will, for two reasons, basically. One is that our powers are wider than the Home Office powers. We're not restricted to new evidence. We can listen to a case and refer it on the basis of new argument, and we can also refer it on the basis of evidence not before the court, provided that the statutory criteria for the court admitting the evidence is made out. And I think the second point that's worth making is that we actually have powers to go out and get the evidence. But we are not dependent upon somebody handing us a file. We go out and do our own investigation.
But isn't there always a problem with these cases in that they go through a court, it's a very exhaustive process, and there's then always an inertia attached to them which stops other people deciding to reopen them?
Well, there is, of course, that sort of problem, but provided that an applicant comes to us with a reasonable case to look at, we will look at it, and we're not going to be affected by that sort of inertia. It doesn't really apply to the Commission because our whole purpose is to look into alleged miscarriages.
You worried, Benedict Bernberg, that this organisation isn't perhaps as hands-on politically as Home Secretaries? They're not as visible.
They're not as visible, and that's a good thing. I mean, I think it was important to take this thing out of the political arena. The Home Office always had an invidious role to play because, after all, they were responsible for the administration of the justice system. To expect that same Home Office to investigate miscarriages of justice was just always a nonsense, it seemed to me. That's what the Runciman Commission found. That's as a result of that the CCRC was established.
Yeah, obviously, we don't have hanging anymore, but do you think miscarriages of justice of this size and the correction of them particularly can be foreseen in the future or ruled out?
One's always worried about any steps that make it easier to convict people, because if it's easier to convict people, inevitably there are going to be more miscarriages of justice. And the steps, for instance, the thing that we're talking at the moment about watering down jury trial at this very moment, these sort of things ultimately will result in more miscarriages of justice.
Thank you all very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.